Hi, Rod Driver. Welcome back. 10 by 6.
Thank you very much for having me on again. It's nice to be here.
First of a two-parter this week. Because it's so expansive and it's so detailed, we're going to look at it over 2 weeks, and that's the topic of propaganda.
Yes,
and
indeed.
Our focus this week is going to be on the idea that we are totally enshrined and totally surrounded by propaganda, and also the propaganda that we tend to get from corporations. They have huge budgets and they are able to use their PR machine in order to give this illusion that the propaganda is actually good for us, and therefore we, through, as I say, multi-billion-pound advertising and etc., we are sucked into an idea that reality actually isn't what we want. So over to you, Rod.
Thank you very much for that introduction. So we're going to do 2 weeks on propaganda. So next week we'll do war propaganda, which is what most people think about whenever the word propaganda gets mentioned. But in fact, propaganda is much broader than that. So propaganda is really about distortion of information to manipulate the thoughts and actions of ordinary people. And in Britain and America, it's probably one of the most powerful forces that influence people every day. But the vast majority of people are completely unaware of it. So some people will be familiar with terms like spin, which is used as a colloquial term to talk about government propaganda. Some people might be familiar with terms like PR or public relations, which is sometimes associated with corporate propaganda. So we're gonna talk about all of those things today. So it's important to understand that if you look at most discussions of propaganda, they'll talk about a poster or they'll talk about a specific article. But in fact, what I'm talking about is when the whole mainstream system, the media system, so that's television news, current affairs programs, newspapers, but general discussions more broadly in magazines and so on, contain certain biases. And you start to realize once you study it that you are actually bombarded with it every single day. So a few years ago, Noam Chomsky, who I've talked about in relation to the media, wrote a book called Manufacturing Consent. And he used the term propaganda managed democracy, where he describes it as controlling people whilst they think they have freedom of action. And that is a pretty good description of the way the system works. So the idea is the propaganda system directs people's attention away from thinking critically about the military, the corporate, economic and financial systems, the political system and the legal system. So we sort of accept them as they are without questioning how they operate. And I've talked about the concept of censorship by omission, where whole sets of ideas or points of view are just missing from mainstream coverage. So propaganda builds up over many years. It doesn't just kind of happen at a point in time. There's actually layer upon layer of propaganda that started many, many years ago. So imagine information being put forward years ago as deliberate propaganda and going unquestioned. So perhaps about some very important person in the past, and the propaganda claims he did really great things. Over time, that becomes the received wisdom. That becomes the history of our nation. That becomes part of our culture, part of our understanding of how things work. And over time, lots and lots of this ends up surrounding us and influencing our thoughts on every important aspect of our lives. And it influences what gets talked about. It influences who benefits from certain aspects of society. It also limits our views as to which opinions are considered reasonable and which are considered unreasonable. And what happens is that whilst most propaganda starts out as something that's deliberately created by somebody or an organization to distort our understanding of something, over time, lots of people will repeat it without even being aware that they're repeating propaganda. So you could see a news item, let's say about weapons of mass destruction, And you'll repeat that in your conversation with your friends. Well, you're repeating propaganda without even being aware of it. But this applies very broadly. So if you look at TV producers who are doing general chat shows, or magazine editors, all of this influences who they invite onto their show, who the guests are, what views are considered important and whose views are considered unimportant. And so you'll even see this, say, in the obituaries that get published. So people who had a certain set of views or a certain role in life, their obituaries will get published in the mainstream. People who had critical views of the mainstream system, their obituaries tend not to appear in the mainstream media system. So, for example, if you watch the mainstream media a lot, there's a sort of unstated assumption that it's okay to have unlimited wealth. It's okay to have multimillionaires and billionaires. And it's okay to have companies that control unlimited amounts of land or property or shares or wealth. And if you look at a magazine like Forbes, it positively celebrates extreme wealth. And in fact, we've got to a point in our societies where we define success primarily by wealth. It's how much money you've got, if you've got a big house, if you've got an expensive car, and so on. All of the downsides of great wealth, which we'll discuss in much more detail in future shows, but includes downsides related to the manipulation of politics, ownership of the media, manipulation of house prices. All of those are ignored. And yet great wealth has very negative consequences for many people in society, but that's never discussed. So we're indoctrinated to believe that rich people earn their wealth. The idea that much of their wealth is achieved by unethical means, again, is never discussed. But by being uncritical of wealth, it means that we're actually uncritical of how society works. And so it means that in order to move beyond propaganda, we need to start questioning everything, which is a sort of mantra of mine, that always question everything. So there are one or two specific areas that are worth talking about, because propaganda sort of is very powerful within them. One of them is history. So if you look at most mainstream history texts in Britain and America, they will exaggerate the positives of famous historical people, and they will understate the negative role of many of these very powerful people. So history books will whitewash the reputations of people, and they'll celebrate their role and erase their crimes. So, for example, Winston Churchill would be a great example of this. He's portrayed as this very, very great war leader during World War II and so on. In fact, he was actually a racist, and he was completely supportive of mass murder by Britain in its colonies. And we're starting to see signs of people questioning this in the last couple of years, where people are pulling down statues of historical people who were slave owners, people who got wealthy by colonial exploitation or for drugs into China a long time ago, and so on. So we're starting to see ordinary people question some elements of propaganda. So if you look at, say, the country houses in Britain, many of them were built a long time ago as status symbols for their owners, and they're now sort of monuments. But many of those people who built those country houses got rich because they were slave owners, or because they got compensation when they lost their slaves, or through colonial exploitation. Similarly, if you look at churches, they'll sometimes have a plaque in them saying this wealthy donor donated this money to help build this church, and wasn't that person wonderful, sort of thing. And again, that will fail to mention how that person achieved their wealth through slavery and colonial exploitation. And so we see the names of some of these historical people are on street names. And so what you start to realize is the whole infrastructure of the country that's been built up over many years portrays these people in a very positive sense, when in fact, many of them did very, very criminal things. And if you look at the way the media describes a sort of nation, if you like, so if you were to say, what are American values? Well, American media is forever saying, well, our values are freedom and democracy. Well, American values have very little to do with freedom or democracy. It's about power, money, war, exploitation. You could come up with a huge list of sort of negative words to describe what the United States and Britain is really about, and none of these are positive. So before I move on to the next stage, I want to stress this point. The positive portrayal of rich people, both in the past and in the present, has an immense propaganda role that most people are not aware of. So another kind of area that ties in with history is museums. And a number of writers have noted that war museums particularly celebrate some of Britain's most violent crimes in our former colonies. And they'll talk about people being awarded with medals and those people being presented as heroes. Whereas in fact, those medals were awarded sometimes for massacring people in those other countries. So there's a positive portrayal of something that actually was very negative for many of the other people involved. And then if you think more widely, you start to realize that organizations that call themselves think tanks, that claim to be independent research organizations, in fact, they're funded by very wealthy donors, and the information they put forward is distorted in support of those very wealthy donors. Universities, it's becoming more and more clear, are not very critical of many aspects of the existing system. So the areas that I research particularly, that would be economics, finance, politics, and international relations. The vast majority of university teaching, I would describe as junk. It completely buys into the mainstream narrative that Britain and America have positive intentions in their foreign policies. They rarely talk about Britain and America committing war crimes, but they also buy into the economic and financial system that actually, if you were sort of thinking critically, you'd say, well, that's a huge amount of unethical behavior and quite a lot of criminal behavior, and quite a lot of fraud and so on. But that's not really taught within mainstream universities. So it's a small proportion of lecturers who will actually encourage their students to ask really hard questions about the way the system works. And you've got academic journals that have a bias where they will publish things that relate to this mainstream thinking. If you want to write something very critical and get it published, most journals will reject it. And some academics have actually tried to set up their own separate journals to allow critical thinking in their subject because it's so difficult to get published in the mainstream. And we've seen in economics particularly that students have been protesting since the financial crisis of 2008, saying the content of our economics courses is junk, it's irrelevant, it has nothing to do with the real world, it's just theory in a textbook. And they've been crying out for change, but the economics profession as a whole has been extremely resistant to change, and where they have introduced changes, it's really just tinkering at the edges. And you can even see it in the publishing industry, where if you write something that's very, very critical of the system, then publishers are very reluctant to criticize it unless you're a very highly rewarded academic lecturer, or whether you're a celebrity. If you're a celebrity, you can get anything published these days. And again, a sort of more minor issue would be honors. And people are rewarded for not challenging the system. And so if you look at the Nobel Peace Prize, it's been awarded to Henry Kissinger and Barack Obama, two of the most monstrous war criminals in human history. And if you look at the economics prize, the Nobel Economics Prize, it's been awarded mostly to people who promoted a very extreme form economic system that I would label as neoliberalism, which is about power for investors and big companies. And in fact, various people, various economists have actually challenged the Nobel Economics Prize and said, look, this is clearly just propaganda to promote a certain worldview. And of course, in fact, the Nobel Prize itself was set up to whitewash the reputation of Alfred Nobel because he'd actually invented dynamite, which played a role, obviously, in killing lots of people in multiple wars a long time ago. So not everyone is conscious they spread propaganda. So propaganda is effective because many ordinary people will repeat it without really questioning it. So just to finish off this first section about general propaganda, there's a concept which is worth understanding, which is called the Overton Window, which is about a certain range of views coming to seem natural, and then other views outside that window just seeming absurd and ridiculous. And what happens is that this becomes so powerful that if people think ideas that are outside this narrow window, they'll actually start to self-censor because they're worried that they will be mocked by their friends and their family and their colleagues for having expressed an opinion that's outside this range. So what we see is a sort of psychological trait, again, that we'll talk about psychology a bit more in a future week, but where people have a very strong desire to conform. And so in order to fit in with the people around them, people will self-censor and they won't express views outside this window. But that means that more and more people stop expressing critical views. And so it becomes harder and harder to find information where the ideas are anything other than the mainstream system. Okay, so I'm going to spend the second half of today talking about corporate propaganda, which some people call public relations, because again, that's an incredibly powerful force in modern life, but most people are unaware that it exists at all. And one of the leading researchers on the subject is a man called Alex Carey. And I'm going to read out two quotes of his, which summarize the situation quite nicely. The 20th century has been characterized by three developments of great political importance: the growth of democracy, the growth of corporate power, and the growth of corporate propaganda as a means of protecting corporate power against democracy. Now that, to me, beautifully summarizes what's gone on for approximately the last 100 years, which has been the period when we've had really serious investment in corporate propaganda. And he's got a second quote, which is this: one of the great achievements of business propaganda has been to make us believe that we are free from propaganda. And again, I think that's incredibly important. The vast majority of people have no idea that they are being bombarded with corporate propaganda every day. And one of the more recent writers about this is a man called Jonathan Cook, who does some outstanding journalist, and he's still writing today. And he's written that propaganda has a very specific role, which is about separating the link between corporate profit and the harm that companies do to the environment, to communities, and their exploitation of staff and customers and suppliers and of governments. And I think that's very true, that propaganda is very much about trying to make us see big business in a positive sense and to completely ignore or be unaware of all the negative aspects of the biggest and most powerful businesses. So propaganda, corporate propaganda, works through multiple channels. So firstly, they feed a great deal of information to the mainstream news, but they were also trying to influence politicians. They try to influence academics. Advertising is an enormous source of corporate propaganda, and we may talk about that in a separate session. They go to extreme lengths where they will set up fake grassroots organizations where they pretend to be activists campaigning for something. And they will essentially manipulate regulators. Let's say you're a financial regulator. Well, the corporate PR and corporate lobbyists will try to influence the understanding of the regulators to make them see the world from the point of view of big business and to forget the downsides of big business. And they will give briefings, very specific briefings to editors and journalists in newspapers and magazines to encourage them to put out material that sees the world from the corporate point of view. Now, this works on an enormous scale. So the most recent research I came across suggested there are three enormous global PR companies that employ over 200,000 people in 170 countries. So there are approximately 3 times as many people in public relations as actually work in the media. So this is a huge number of people. They have enormous budgets. We're talking billions and billions of pounds and dollars spent on corporate propaganda. But because it's all behind the scenes and it's almost never discussed by the mainstream media, most people are completely unaware it even exists. And various researchers looked at corporate propaganda in the 20th century, and it wasn't just individual companies do this. They'll set up organizations. So in America, they had the National Association of Manufacturers. And in Britain, for a while, there was an organization called Aims of Industry, which was specifically public relations firms set up to represent whole swathes of businesses in America and Britain. And they would bombard originally the radio airwaves and then later on the television airwaves with enormous amounts of material that was intended to have a sort of pro-corporate corporate bias. So if we look at some of the specific things that public relations companies do, one very important role they have is what's called crisis management, which involves whitewashing reputations. So for example, if a company such as Union Carbide has a disaster in Bhopal in India, as happened a few decades ago, which poisoned lots of people, and it's still believed to be causing birth defects to the present day, then a PR company will be employed by Union Carbide to try and put out propaganda to try and say, oh, well, it wasn't really our fault. The damage that's been done is not that serious. We've dealt with it, and so on. And the whitewashing of reputations doesn't just apply to companies, it also applies to governments. So the military dictatorship in Argentina, which ended up having a war over the Falklands in 1982 with Great Britain, they actually employed public relations companies to try to whitewash their image, to try to pretend that they weren't a dictatorship. Similarly, the Saudis after 9/11 employed PR companies to try to whitewash their reputations, because most of the terrorists involved in the 9/11 attacks came from Saudi Arabia, but there was all sorts of PR and propaganda put out to mislead people as to the Saudi Arabians' true role in those events. So one of the things to bear in mind is that there are no ethical standards when it comes to public relations and PR and so on. So where people have protested against companies, PR companies will smear them with false stories, they'll use legal intimidation, and they'll come up with what's called junk science. So they've put out press releases in the past trying to claim that asbestos was safe, and chemicals such as DDT, they try to claim that that is safe too, and so on. So they will use any technique that they can get away with to try and distort our understanding of what's going on. So one of the things that they're sort of notorious for is what's called astroturf lobbying. So this is setting up fake grassroots organizations. So there was one called the American Council on Science and Health. Well, in fact, that was just a front company for many big companies that used poisonous chemicals. And this American Council for Science and Health was trying to give the impression that there's nothing wrong with any of these chemicals. And then the Campaign for Creativity, that was a fake grassroots lobbying organization, which was really just Microsoft wanting stronger patents. And the Kuwaiti government set up an organization called Citizens for a Free Kuwait, which again was a fake grassroots lobbying organization which told false stories in the run-up to the Iraq war about Iraqi soldiers taking babies out of incubators, throwing them on the ground and killing them, to try and persuade American politicians to support American intervention in Iraq and Kuwait. So PR companies are everywhere manipulating many of the stories that we see in the mainstream media. Now, in fact, this came to light in 2017. And there was a very famous or notorious case where one of the biggest PR companies called Bell Pottinger had been deliberately exacerbating racism in South Africa. And word of this came to light. And their reputation was badly damaged. And so many of their clients didn't want to work with them anymore. So in fact, Bell Pottinger actually went bankrupt in the end. But many of the executives from Bell Pottinger will simply have gone to work for other PR companies. But when people investigated what exactly Bell Pottinger had been doing in the previous few years, they'd made fake terror videos for the US government to justify America's actions in relation to the war on terror. They set up networks of fake bloggers, people writing on Twitter and other places on the internet, other social media sites, to put out false stories and false opinions. They change Wikipedia entries for their clients to make their clients look more positive than they really are and try to get negative things removed. They manipulate search engines so the positive findings for their clients come at the top and any criticism of their clients is hidden further down a few pages later. And they were doing huge amounts of public relations for many countries that were involved in human rights abuses. So what they were doing was simply an example of what all the other PR companies were doing, but because what they were doing got into the press, they suffered, but other PR companies have simply carried on. So one standard strategy that they use is sometimes called deny, doubt, delay, discourse. And this was something that the tobacco companies became famous for. So the idea is that when people start to question, in this case, let's say the health effects of tobacco causing lung cancer, the first thing the companies will do is to deny it. Then they'll, as time goes on and it becomes more difficult to deny it, they'll set up their own research centers and they'll ensure that the information that comes from their research centers casts doubt on the evidence saying that tobacco is harmful. And one of the things that PR people have realized over many years is they never have to prove anything. If they simply cast doubt on other evidence, then that's enough that most people will simply believe what they want to believe. So they can carry on doing whatever it is they want to carry on doing. And then when it becomes clear that there is no doubt that tobacco is harmful, then they'll try to delay change by putting forward recommendations for solutions that they know will be ineffective. So they'll say, let's have a group of people to discuss this. Let's have a bit more transparency. Let's have a bit more information. They know that these are not going to be solutions. And at the same time as that, they'll be working in the background to block effective legislation by lobbying against it. And they'll engage in more and more discourse. So they're talking about solutions whilst trying not to do anything about it. Now that sequence of events worked for decades and decades for the tobacco industry before they were finally taken to court and paid huge amounts of compensation. But in fact, those tactics are being replicated today by other industries such as sugar, alcohol, and gambling. So what you might call addiction industries, which are trying to do the whole kind of deny there's a problem and then cast doubt and then delay solutions and then engage in conversation and so on. So that process is repeated. So one area that we will talk about more in future sessions is about advertising. Now, this is often considered to be separate from corporate propaganda, but in fact, because we're bombarded with so much advertising all the time, it's estimated that many people in America will receive 1 million advertisements in their lifetime. Then it has a very big effect on how we think about the world. And companies are forever putting forward misleading adverts. So if you look at the oil company BP, their slogan for many years has been Beyond Petroleum, trying to give the impression that they're very green and they're really trying to move away from the use of oil and from things that cause climate change and to do renewable technologies. Whereas in fact, only a tiny proportion of their budget is in any of these new industries. In fact, they're still very much an oil-based industry. So it's entirely misleading and deceptive. So if you look specifically, say, at the tobacco industry, they were famous for doing one of the first very successful public relations campaigns. So in 1929, at the time, very few women smoked, and tobacco companies wanted more women to buy cigarettes. And so there was an Easter parade in New York. And what they did was they gave lots of debutantes cigarettes to smoke in that parade. And they presented this as an example of women's rights, that women had freedom and could smoke if they choose. And it was hugely successful. Smoking for women went through the roof quite rapidly after that parade. So it was an amazing example of just how powerful PR or propaganda campaigns can be. If you look at another industry, so the nuclear industry, when that first started, they used to use the phrase energy too cheap to meter, even though in fact there were many studies showing that the total cost of nuclear energy was going to be enormous in the long term. And there were various safety studies that showed there were enormous dangers of nuclear energy. And we've had a couple of very serious nuclear disasters over the years. And various studies had predicted that these things would happen, but those studies were always kept secret. So it's very important, if you want to get through propaganda, it's similar to getting past what the mainstream media tells you. You have to seek out alternative views on the internet. You have to find critical journalism, and you have to start to question everything. Now, there's an infinite amount more that I could add, but I think that's probably quite a good place to sort of begin a sort of more general discussion. Over to you, Jason.
Astonishing, Rod. Thank you so much. I think I've probably taken more notes in this particular session than I have in previous ones, because it stimulates so much thought, bearing in mind that effectively the overriding message that you're giving is that from cradle to grave, for most, if not all of us, our lives are effectively a lie.
I think that's a good summary, yeah.
They're manipulated, molded reality that's so distorted that actually finding reality itself now is probably a fool's errand, because it would take so long and be so expensive in order to even scrape the surface, bearing in mind the packaging upon packaging upon packaging that's taken place for our existence. But I have noted so many things. Just
whilst you're looking at your notes, I want to say I often think more and more about the film The Matrix, and I imagine most viewers have probably seen it at some point, which is about a character taking a pill to sort of wake up and realize that the world he lives with is a completely imaginary world, and that reality is very different. And I often think I'd love to go and talk to the producers of that film to see how much they were thinking that what they're talking about is really a sort of allegory of what countries such as America and Britain are actually like in the present day, because I think they probably were trying to convey that to some extent.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They were trying to convey that. I think the problem is the Matrix has become surrounded in this, I don't know, symbolism, if you like, primarily because it's such a standalone. It's not, if our media, or if an alternative media was given licenses to have television programs on network TV and radio stations, and bombarded the public with explanations as you've given today, or films, documentaries, whatever, the Overton window would crash and burn, because people over time would suddenly realize that in order to find reality, you needed to adopt a whole new set of techniques and strategies than the ones that we're being educated to use, which just fulfill the sort of corporate ruling class raison d'etre. So I think, yeah, you're absolutely right about the Matrix, but because it's so standalone, it's just something that people will say, oh, the Matrix, but it hasn't made a scrap of difference really, because
well, I don't think most people realize that perhaps it is saying something about the real world. And so there'll be a handful of science fiction buffs who've kind of thought, yeah, it is actually relevant. But I think the vast majority of people just see it as a Hollywood movie. And
And to some extent, I agree. But I mean, over the years, I have seen people put clips from The Matrix. Susan, I just move Flo because she's being persistent. Here I go, sweetheart. I think the younger people who watched the film over the last two decades or so, there's a strong realization, but it's just become a GIF, you know, a GIF, a GIF on Twitter or on Facebook, you know,
sure.
a 5-second thing from The Matrix, or somebody's put a quote from The Matrix, or somebody's just written, "Oh, this is The Matrix." So there's a lot of understanding by a lot of people, probably not the majority, of course, but there is a lot of understanding that The Matrix, what it symbolizes, what it represents. But if we can just go back to some of the key points, that it's an interesting question when you say that most people are unaware of it. But also, I think we need to, we understand, certainly from social media, that there are many, many, many people who are aware of it. It's just that they can't do anything about it.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think that's a really important distinction, because it pacifies the whole population if we just say very few people or most people are unaware of it, when in fact the reality is that people actually just feel completely disempowered even though they are aware of it.
It would be interesting to see some research on the extent to which the proportion of people are aware of it. I'm always slightly disappointed that with the people that I get to talk to who are not sort of very aware of it and talk about it all the time, you know, kind of academics and researchers who do analyze this stuff, but in the general population, I think I might have mentioned that I often see my family as a kind of a hint at what's going on, that even though I'm trying to explain this to them, they still insist on watching mainstream news and current affairs and reading mainstream newspapers all the time. And to me, that's an indication that they don't really understand the extent of the propaganda, that if they did understand it, they would stop doing those things. So I think you're right. There is a substantial minority of the population, and it may be greater with young people, who are starting to see through the propaganda. I think there's a number of related points to that, and that I think the criminality of our governments is becoming more blatant. And so the CIA used to try and do things secretly for the first few years of its existence. Now, people like John Bolton in the US administration will just say, well, we want to overthrow the government of Venezuela to get their resources. And so I think they're feeling the need to hide what they're doing less. And perhaps that's unfortunately related to the fact that they feel more powerful. I was talking about this with somebody last night. There may have been a period in the 1950s and 1960s where if governments were honest about what was going on, there was enough opposition to them within the political system that they would be forced to change policy. Whereas I think now, it doesn't seem to matter how many people dislike what the government do. And we saw this with the Iraq protests. The government recognized they can just do it anyway. And so I think they feel they can get away with being more blatant. So I think it's more out in the open a little bit, and young people are picking up on this. So I am optimistic in the long term that enough young people will recognize it for what it is, and gradually change will come about. But I can't predict what timescale that will be.
I mean, it obviously is a very complex discussion and analysis. And I think, you know, the fact that we had 2 million people back in 2003 who were willing to go on the streets and demonstrate against the Iraq war, but governments are aware that that's effectively where it ends. That even if they then still go to war and have some fake justification, you know, the 45-minute thing and all that sort of stuff, they also know that the people who demonstrated, very few of them will take it to the next level.
Absolutely, I agree, yeah.
And that's the issue. That's the issue. It's the fact that the tools required in order to turn over the propagandists and the liars and the cheats aren't in place for obvious reasons, because it's the last thing that the system would ever ensure were put in place.
Yeah.
And also what then tends to happen of all the things that you just mentioned in terms of being able to, again, through the Overton window, being able to treat people who stand up to this corruption and this propaganda. You create this picture, you create another image, and you label them with it and you bombard them with it. So effectively, the majority of people stop seeing the Iraq War as the problem. They start seeing the people who are standing up to those people who want to go to war as a problem. And as soon as you obviously enter into the war theatre itself, lots of people then are then pushed to get behind their country and their service people, because if they're not, then they're seen as being almost traitors.
Absolutely. And so I was going to say, we'll talk in a future week about concepts like patriotism and nationalism, which are incredibly powerful propaganda tools. And so we'll look at war propaganda specifically in a future week, because I think that's a fascinating area.
Yes, but it's just the point we're trying to make is that propaganda isn't a one-trick pony. Propaganda is a rolling machine that's got answers to pretty much every question that threatens the establishment.
Absolutely, yes. It's incredibly powerful and multi-layered, yeah.
One of the things I picked up on was the idea that the media constantly, especially the corporate media, I should say, but I guess independent media in some respects as well, they pick on voices that are perceived acceptable, that fit into in terms of the corporate media, in terms of the mainstream thinking, and they constantly invite them back. So therefore, all you do is you get this legitimation of a certain type of thinking, because you don't get the so-called pluralist view, which is a whole range of different ideas which are treated with equal respect. You get specific ideas that are over and over and over repeated. And then when you do bring people in from the outside, as we've seen recently with the Insulate Britain being brought into the corporate media, they are just constantly whacked. They're not treated with respect. Their ideas haven't been thought through in terms of the mainstream perspective. So it's just, let's focus on something that we can keep hitting them with, and we can keep getting the audiences stirred up about. Yeah. So in the end, the actual meaning of what was behind the demonstration or the protest, and whatever it might be, is almost completely lost, because the corporate media have taken us down another road.
Yes, so that's a sort of standard PR technique. So there are hundreds and hundreds of different PR techniques that we could discuss, but this idea of not focusing on the issues that really matter and focusing on other things that are much less important is a really key strategy that the mainstream media and corporate PR companies will focus on all the time. And so you'll see this kind of smearing of individuals, this labeling them, even simple things, the simple use of words like labeling someone as a radical immediately portrays them as in a negative light. Whereas you invite a politician on, you always introduce them as the right honourable, and it immediately presents them in a positive light.
Yes.
When in fact, there's nothing very honourable about most modern day politicians in Britain.
No, and I think language in itself is now manufactured.
Absolutely, yes, it very much so.
The meaning that we attach to so many words has evolved over time as propaganda has become more entrenched. So actually, when we look a word up in the dictionary, often now that word can just reflect a recent manufactured development, especially with new words that have been introduced. I mean, if you go back, for example, let's say 20, 25 years, the word chav, it was utilized in such a way that it moved completely away from the Romany meaning of the 17th, 16th centuries. And it became very much this idea, and somebody came up with, obviously, the attachment to council houses. So straight away, anybody who lived on the council house was a chav. Anybody who dressed in a particular way, the shell suit or whatever, became a chav. And the chav became the people that hung around on street corners, the ones that were smoking weed in public, the ones that were doing petty crime. They were sort of somehow the bruise, or the very obvious birthmark of the body politic, because people were able to say, oh, there's a problem. Let's keep talking about chavs for goodness knows how long in the newspapers and on television, using that term.
Yeah.
It became utterly derogatory. Interestingly, though, what happened for young people is a lot of them saw through it. And a lot of them actually started dressing like that to create this sort of safety zone around this group of people. So actually the young people, not in all cases, but in many cases, they responded by dressing the same, behaving the same, basically putting a finger up to the establishment who were attacking their friends. And the way in which the label was manufactured in the media bore no relation for these young people to their friends, who were intelligent, lovely, empathetic people, right, who just had had this label whacked on their forehead. So if sometimes propaganda actually can lead to a response by a demographic who puts their hands up and says, I'm not accepting this.
Yeah, well, so I've never actually studied the evolution of the use of the word chav. So for me, that was all new to me. There was a specific point that I wanted to relate to when you were sort of saying, yes, let's look at the meaning of words, which is that one of the things that's notable about people who study propaganda is that some of the best ones are linguistic experts. And Noam Chomsky is very famous as one of the world's leading experts on propaganda, but his original academic focus was actually in linguistics. And it's people who really do understand how language can be weaponized that recognize the power of propaganda. And I think it's something that I would hope over time we can get more and more people to understand, that subtle changes in the way you use a word can over time have a very big effect on what people think.
Yes, I mean, in my past roles as a lecturer, teaching sociology and philosophy, and one of the newer aspects over the last few decades that's risen, and something I really try and get the students to focus in on, is poststructuralism, and the whole way in which language in itself is lent meaning, is given meaning, largely, not entirely, but largely from above. So that it feeds into this whole discourse and narrative that you've been talking about in relation to propaganda, creating this complete illusion and undermining reality. Because as soon as you start using those words that are actually their meanings determined for you elsewhere, and the elsewhere does not have your best interests at heart, it becomes almost impossible to break away from, to shake off, unless you formulate your own language, which of course then means that people don't understand what you're saying. So you end up having to fall back into using theirs.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point, actually, that even the best of us fall into traps that sort of laid by the mainstream and laid by the propagandists and laid by the people who do PR, in terms of using the language that they choose in a way that they determine. And it's really hard to fight and resist against it all the time. It is a constant battle to actually say, well, look, you've used that word in a misleading way, you've used this phrase in a misleading way. And you start to realize that you have to think carefully about sort of every phrase that you use. Otherwise, you end up reinforcing a point of view that actually you weren't intending to, and so on.
Yes, no, absolutely. Interesting when you talked about, and this is something I've noticed, and it does frustrate me a lot, is the way in which churches are propped up by long since dead wealthy landowners who have these Esquire plaques on the wall. And you think, well, when you walk into these churches, actually, these churches are supposed to be, symbolically the house of God, and in the house of God, everybody is equal. And yet from the very early days, churches have never treated the population as equal. So they reinforce the inequality hierarchy propaganda that comes directly from the establishment and the ruling classes. So you can see why so many argue that the church is merely a tool. you'd already mentioned that in a way. But the other thing that really gets me a bit is the fact that so many churches are legitimating and reinforcing the idea of war, because they constantly have a list of the local people who died, especially during World War I and World War II. So instead of the church standing up to the idea of what really created, what was really behind both those wars, they just, as I say, they just reinforce and legitimate it by sticking a whole load of names up there, and so that we can say, oh, these heroes, these wonderful people who gave off and fought for our country, without ever going down the road of actually understanding why that war began and how these people were just used. Their lives were cut short, not because they defeated another country. Their lives were cut short because the establishment within our own country was colluding with the establishments of the countries we were at war with directly before, and go back to doing directly after. And as we've seen with the Second World War, in relation to the big corporations in America, they were colluding with the Nazis throughout the Second World War. So it's not just about propaganda here, it's about people giving their lives for a lie. And the church is reinforcing that, Rod.
Yes, so we'll do war propaganda properly next week. But I think,
of course, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. So, but I think you're absolutely right that the church and many other kind of institutions do kind of perpetuate various myths, and it's when you start to kind of examine each one in detail. So you sort of look at your museums, and you look at the history of the churches, and you start to be critical, as you've just been doing, and it really starts to bring home to you the fact that you are surrounded by a kind of misinformation. And kind of what you were saying immediately after I finished, and you were saying it is like this situation where your whole life is a lie. And the strange thing is, I'm aware, and I think I may have mentioned this before, that until I was 35, I didn't know any of this stuff. I believed what I saw in the news, newspapers and TV and so on, and I bought the mainstream story, not quite hook, line and sinker, because there was always a kind of question mark at the back of my head. But it never occurred to me to actually sit down and do the research and to question it seriously. But then once you do start to sort of scratch below the surface, you suddenly realize actually it is all a bit of an illusion.
Yes. But it goes back again to the main issue that you learn to draw back the curtains, you learn to look out on reality. But then, of course, the next step is what you do about it.
Indeed, that's a big question. Yeah.
I love the way you obviously bearing in mind your background in terms of teaching, lecturing in universities, and you're correct that a lot of teaching obviously related to the courses that you taught, or not across the board, is junk.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there was once upon a time, this perspective that you actually went to university and you chose certain courses because you wanted to explore reality by being critical. And yet what you're saying, and I think what a lot of us know it anyway, is that whereas the schooling system has largely been described as a factory, that the number of university students that we now have, which is effectively 1 in 2 in 2021, bearing in mind it was about 1 in 8 in 1979, but they in turn have become an extension of schools. They in turn have becoming the same sort of factory production line. And actually what you need now to do if you're going to be critical is to step up into postgraduate courses, where there's a lot less people doing it, and there's a lot more people who are, the demand is very much on you being more critical and more self-aware in terms of the extensive knowledge and application of it out there. So it used to be, as I said, it used to be 1 in 8 in 1979 going to so-called learning places. And now it's 1 in 2, and those 1 in 2 aren't really getting an awful lot different, are they, to what they were probably getting in their sixth forms?
So I think that's very true. And this is one of the things that really disappoints me about academia. I actually went back to university as a mature student just to see how badly economics is taught in British universities. And it is appalling. And I actually wrote to the single critical economist that I could find in Cambridge, who actually is worth mentioning by name, because we'll talk about him a lot in later sessions. His name is Ha-Joon Chang, and he writes books for the mainstream public. So he writes some excellent stuff. And I said, if I want to study economics and I see the world like you do, should I come to Cambridge? And he wrote back and said, absolutely not. The department's been hijacked by mathematicians. And so he didn't actually use the word junk, but that's what he was getting at. And so some people, when they hear me saying that a lot of mainstream teaching in economics, finance, international relations, and politics is junk, they'll think I'm exaggerating, but I'm absolutely not. 95% of lecturers in those fields will present the mainstream view of the world, which is a theoretical textbook view of the world of how democracy is wonderful and how free markets are wonderful and all this sort of thing, right? And you look at the real world evidence and you look at the tiny number of academics who challenge that view and say, well, actually, you know, there's so much wrong with the way the world works. That's what we need to talk about. But it's a tiny proportion in most of academia. So there's a sort of department, an economics department in the United States, where they've tried to write their own economics textbook, which is completely different from all the others, which is critical and so on. But it's very, very rare to find good departments like that.
I'm just wondering whether there's ultimately two reasons for that. One that we are quite aware of if we're paying attention to the university sector, and one probably that we're less aware of. And that's the amount of foreign money that's come into universities to set up, for example, business schools. So we've had lots of money. I mean, I went to Warwick University, and they had a lot of money from China and the Far East to help them develop their business schools, etc. And I'm just wondering that what comes with this money isn't just setting up business schools, which of course are going to be very much anti-critical thought unless it's relating to how they can expand the productivity of capitalism. But I'm just wondering how much of a voice or influence they also have in how the university recruits quite generally across the board. And where it goes back to a point that you made last week about the media, in that the corporate media intentionally allow certain, let's say, critical voices in, but they are very much the minority. And what they are then able to do is stand back and say, hey, look, you know, these critical voices have been heard, and therefore we are representing all of public opinion. Well, perhaps that's how the university model is now working. Most of the lecturers are conservative with a small c, they reflect the status quo, but there are a few from the outside of that who are allowed in, so that universities can say, oh, hang on a minute, that accusation is inappropriate.
Well, so I think that's a really good question. You know, one day I want to actually try and research the question, what do economics lecturers actually believe, and how did they get to the position they're in now? And perhaps the wider question, what do powerful people actually believe? Because I think that's quite interesting. Perhaps we'll talk about that in psychology one day.
Yeah.
But so I think the university teaching system is being influenced by corporate money. And as you say, the business school thing is where that's seen most clearly. So what they're churning out of those business schools is people who can be the cog in the machine in the existing system. And I actually did try to teach critical sort of statistical analysis in one of these a few years ago. But I was a kind of rare exception within the department, in that the vast majority of academics there are just teaching how the mainstream system works. And I remember sitting down and having a chat one day with one of the lecturers and saying, what are your views on patents? And he said, well, I think we should get rid of all patents. And I thought, wow, that's an interesting perspective. Do you teach that? And he says, no, it's not my job to teach that. But the point is, it's nobody's job to teach that. If you were to go to the law school, they would be teaching all the cogs in the machine who are doing corporate law and patent law how to work in the system. they wouldn't be teaching the critical view that maybe society would be better off with no patents, or at least much weaker patents, and so on. So you start to realize they just buy into the system, and their job is teaching how the system works. And I think there's lots of different things going on in the minds of different people. So some people are employed to teach certain things, and if the corporate funding creates like a chair in a particular subject, which is a mainstream subject, and they'll teach the mainstream view, then they'll do that. And they won't set up a chair of completely critical finance. Do we need to completely rejig the whole financial system? That job will never be set up. So there's a sort of bias there. Then you've got the bias that an awful lot of people just teach what they learned. So often the people who go into academia were people who were very good students at absorbing the mainstream teaching when they went through university, and they'll go on and rehash that. And there's a bias with the publication of the journals, where in order to be successful as an academic, you need to be published in the leading journals, but the leading journals want the mainstream view, and so on. So you've got all these different aspects of the system, which all push in the direction of reinforcing the mainstream. But at some point in the future, I want to go and talk to some of these people and research in more depth and see if I can say, look, why is it none of you guys are trying to teach the critical view? The world needs the critical view, because otherwise you have the next generation of people graduating from university, and all they do in their jobs is reinforce the existing system. They're actually making it worse. And nobody is going to do a mainstream job which is all about changing the existing system. That role in society doesn't really exist. You have a few underfunded NGOs and campaign organizations, but they have very little power or influence, and so on. So in fact, the critical view rarely gets heard. So, over time, as I've mentioned a number of times before, I think my aim is to try and get young people, particularly schools, but also universities, thinking more about some of these topics and thinking more critically, questioning everything. So hopefully over time, we can develop a generation of people who will think differently.
Yes, and I think it's back to the old one, isn't it? It's where does the money come from? And effectively, if you're chasing the money, you're chasing the majority populace. And if you're chasing the majority populace, they're the ones who have been highly influenced by the propaganda into believing the status quo is the only way forward. Yeah, thank you. In relation to, I mean, obviously you used the word terrorist and I used the word terrorist, but we could argue that it is in itself, again, we are victims of propaganda, because as you talked about in previous programs, when you inflict terror, whatever that terror is, you should effectively become a terrorist, whether it's legitimate or illegitimate, whether it's sanctioned by the state or not sanctioned by the state. It's terror. So I think it goes back to language again, that doesn't matter where we are on the political spectrum, we are often victims, if you like, of the way in which propaganda has affected us and narrowed the way in which we see reality. There's also just a couple of things as well. You talked about the Nobel Prize, and you talked about obviously Henry Kissinger and Barack Obama, but also if you go back to the end of the 1970s, I don't know if you remember, but you had the Nobel Peace Prize was given equally to Jimmy Carter, Malcolm Reagan, and Anwar Sadat, because of the fact that they managed to bring them together at Camp David in terms of creating peace between the Palestinians between Egypt and between Israel. And yet, and it reinforces exactly what you say, within 2 years, Sadat had been assassinated and murdered. And the suggestions are, again, that the American Secret Services played at least a partial role in enabling that. So even when we give out the Nobel Peace Prize as this symbolic thing to try and create this illusion across the planet, it doesn't stop the dark forces behind the scenes continuing to do what they do, and even eliminating Nobel Peace Prize winners quite quickly after we give it to them. So that in itself is interesting, and linking that also to Bell Pottinger, and obviously its eventual collapse. And you'll sort of say that most of the employees almost certainly went into other PR corporations, but it doesn't sound an awful lot different to where the US and the UK recruited leading Nazis, especially from the scientific community, after the Second World War. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like, where's the money? How do we contain power? How do we do what we want to do? And nothing else we're concerned about.
Yeah, so I actually think that's a good analogy, and particularly because I'd said, look, there are no ethics in the PR industry. And I think you take that one step further and say, and in British and American government policy, there are even fewer ethics, you know. So I think you're right. It's the analogy with the recruitment of the German scientists just shows how that they really do not care about right and wrong, this sort of thing. You know, they're only interested in power, wealth, control, and so on.
Yes. And finishing off is a conversation we had before the program began, before we started recording, and it relates to you talking about the deny, doubt, and delay. And I think this is another classic example at the moment of climate change. And I think we talked about today off screen some of the issues there, but in relation to, it's not a man-made thing, it's not a human-made thing. Okay, deny. Then you create doubt by creating all these different agencies, and people who go on social media are probably paid to say that it's not about human-made, it's about all other natural physical outcomes of, you know, the sunspots or volcanoes or whatever, and it's just nature creating it. And then, of course, when people look at all the data and they see that from the Industrial Revolution upwards, in terms of climate change, it suddenly goes straight up, and there's no scientist on the planet with any credibility, and I'll use that as a postfix, without any credibility, that now says that if you look at the effect of the Industrial Revolution upon climate change, it's blatantly obvious. So they then get to that point, like you said, where they can delay, where they can use politicians, and any policy, instead of it being right now, that's it. You know, every prime minister or president or whatever goes on national television at 6 o'clock in the evening. Everybody tunes in because it's all been built up, and they're saying, right, this is it. From tomorrow morning, first thing, we are completely radically overhauling our society. We are creating legislation to dramatically reduce the power of those people who are destroying the climate. It doesn't happen because the corporations, excuse my term, are fisting these politicians in such a way that they effectively just do what they're told. So if the corporations want them to be slow over, I don't know, 40, 50 years, that's exactly what they'll be. They'll keep setting these targets for 2030, 2050, knowing full well that it'll be almost a completely different demographic, which they can then say, oh, 2080, 3000, 2110, or whatever. It's constantly pushing it back because the corporations are setting the agenda. So, I mean, that's probably, you gave brilliant examples of tobacco, gambling, etc., etc. But ultimately, the biggest one at the moment is climate change.
So I think the climate change is really interesting because occasionally, in any of these issues that we talk about, we see the system kind of wrestling with itself. So what Noam Chomsky talks about is elite disunity, where powerful groups disagree with each other. And in fact, you can see a simple example of this in relation to private healthcare in America, where some groups of companies would like a proper healthcare system like the NHS because they object to the costs to them of the private system. So you can see powerful people disagreeing with each other. With the climate change, I think there was a change in the discussions a few years ago where very suddenly the BBC said, we're going to change the way we present climate change. We're going to buy into it, basically. Up until that point, if ever there was somebody talking about climate change, they would nearly always say, well, we have to do balance. So here's a climate change denier on alongside. And that was their idea of doing balance. That changed a few years ago where they said they're not going to have the climate change deniers on the BBC nearly so much. Now, I think that coincided with the financiers recognizing that actually the transition to renewable energies could become an enormous cash cow for them.
Yes.
And I think
Yes,
in
absolutely.
the next few years, we may see a kind of battle among different groups of powerful elites. So financiers and people who are investing in renewable energy on one side, and oil companies and other related companies on the other side, having a little bit of a ding dong that will kind of, usually these things happen behind the scenes, but it emerges into the public if the thing is big enough, where I think the financiers would really like to set up markets in, gambling on the value of renewable energy in Panama, or, all sorts of complex financial markets where they can just extract more and more wealth by what's going on. And they'll gamble on weather futures, and they'll gamble on all sorts of things. So I think there are groups of powerful people who would actually like to drive the transition ahead, and we'll see that emerging. And it'll be interesting to see which group is sort of dominant, if one group becomes dominant over time.
And it's a great place to end, I think, there, Rod, in terms of us coming back to cynical sociopaths who are controlling the planet for their own ends and for their own investment purposes. And I think that's probably going to be a conclusion that we regularly return to. Thank you so much again, Rod. It's been absolutely amazing. And we're going to continue, obviously, with the propaganda theme and more propaganda next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on again. I'll see you next week.